The land below offers little guidance. It stretches outward in muted tones, dust, scrub, and shadow merging into a single, uninterrupted surface. There are no clear markers, no defined lines, only subtle shifts in texture where the terrain rises slightly, then falls again into shallow valleys that dissolve into distance. From altitude, it becomes patterned without meaning. Above it, the aircraft holds a steady course. A twin-engine airliner, its polished metal skin dulled by distance and atmosphere, moves forward with mechanical consistency. The engines produce a continuous, even rhythm, low, stable, unchanging. There is no visible strain, no deviation, just forward motion through open air. Inside the cockpit, the instruments glow faintly. Dials and needles, altitude, airspeed, heading, each holding position within expected margins. The panel is functional, dense, and analog. There are no screens, no automation beyond the most basic stabilization. Every reading must be interpreted, every adjustment deliberate. Outside the forward windows, the horizon is beginning to soften. A thin layer of haze forms where sky meets land. It is not yet obstruction, only a reduction in clarity. Distant features begin to fade first. The far ridge lines, barely perceptible before, now dissolve entirely into the atmosphere. The aircraft continues. Navigation, at this stage, is not precise in the modern sense. It relies on estimation, on headings maintained, on elapsed time, on intermittent radio signals that may or may not align perfectly with expectation. Position is something inferred, not confirmed. Below, the terrain rises gradually. It does not announce itself. There are no sharp cliffs or sudden elevations, only a slow, almost imperceptible increase in height. A plateau forming over distance, the kind of terrain that, from altitude, appears flat until it is not. Cloud begins to gather, not in towering formations, but in a low, spreading layer. Thin at first, then denser. It drifts across the aircraft's path without urgency, obscuring the ground in fragments. Visibility is reduced not completely, but inconsistently. Patches of land appear, then vanish. The horizon fades further. Inside the cockpit, there is no alarm. No warning system exists for terrain proximity. No automated voice. No radar display mapping the land below. Only instruments designed to report the aircraft's internal state, speed, altitude, direction. Nothing external. The aircraft maintains altitude. It remains, by all instrument indications, in controlled flight. But controlled flight depends on reference, and reference is beginning to erode. The haze thickens into a uniform layer ahead. The boundary between sky and earth becomes indistinct, then disappears entirely. What remains is a field of muted gray, without depth or contrast. The aircraft enters it without resistance. Sound remains constant. The engines do not change tone. There is no turbulence significant enough to register beyond minor corrections. Motion continues as before, smooth, uninterrupted. But outside, there is no longer a visible world, only cloud. Within this environment, orientation becomes abstract. The concept of level is no longer something seen. It must be trusted, derived from instruments that themselves depend on calibration, interpretation, and attention. Below the cloud layer, the terrain continues its slow rise. Unseen, unmarked, unacknowledged, the aircraft moves forward at cruising speed, covering distance rapidly. Each minute brings it closer to ground that no longer appears distant, but immediate, though nothing in the cockpit yet reflects that change. Time compresses. Distance closes. Altitude remains constant. The margin between them narrows. There is no single moment where conditions shift from safe to unsafe. No clear boundary. Only gradual convergence, of aircraft and terrain, of assumption and reality. The landscape offers no resistance. It does not signal. It does not warn. It simply exists, fixed, silent, and rising. And above it, an aircraft continues forward, precisely as intended. In 1950, civil aviation in Australia was still in transition. The Second World War had ended only 5 years earlier, leaving behind a surplus of trained pilots, repurposed aircraft, and an expanding demand for domestic air travel. Distances across the continent remained vast. Rail and road infrastructure, while improving, could not match the speed of air transport. Airlines filled that gap. Among them, Australian National Airways stood as one of the country's primary operators. It was not a small carrier. It maintained scheduled services between major cities and remote regions, linking population centers separated by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometers of difficult terrain. Its aircraft were the backbone of that network. Twin-engine, propeller-driven transports, many adapted from wartime designs, were reliable by the standards of the era. They were engineered for endurance rather than precision. Their systems were mechanical. Their navigation capabilities depended heavily on ground-based support and pilot interpretation. Automation, in the modern sense, did not exist. Each flight required continuous input, adjustments to heading, altitude, mixture, and power settings. Instruments provided data, but not interpretation. The responsibility for situational awareness remained entirely within the cockpit. Routes across Australia were not defined by dense infrastructure. Instead, they were shaped by geography and necessity. Airfields were often isolated. Navigation aids, radio beacons, directional transmitters were spaced far apart. In many regions, coverage was intermittent. Signals could weaken or distort depending on atmospheric conditions or terrain interference. Between those points, there was often nothing. No radar surveillance tracked aircraft movements in real time. Air traffic control, where it existed, relied on position reports transmitted by radio, reports that were themselves based on estimation. Position was not observed. It was calculated. Weather forecasting faced similar limitations. Meteorological data was collected from scattered stations, then compiled into broad regional forecasts. These forecasts could describe general conditions, cloud cover, pressure systems, expected visibility, but lacked the resolution to account for localized variations. In a country defined by its scale, weather could change significantly within a single route segment. Low cloud, ground haze, and shifting visibility were common in certain regions, particularly where terrain elevations varied subtly but consistently. These conditions did not always register as severe. They were often categorized as manageable, provided the aircraft maintained adequate separation from the ground. That separation, however, depended on accurate positioning. The route flown on the day of the accident was not considered unusual. It connected established points within the airline's network. It had been flown before, repeatedly, without incident. Pilots assigned to such routes were familiar with their general structure, expected headings, estimated times between fixes, and known landmarks where visibility permitted. But familiarity did not eliminate uncertainty. Without continuous navigation signals, pilots relied on a combination of dead reckoning and intermittent radio fixes. Heading and speed were used to estimate distance traveled. Time became a critical variable. Small deviations, wind drift, minor heading errors could accumulate over distance. An aircraft could be miles from its intended position without immediate indication. Terrain awareness presented an additional challenge. Much of the Australian landscape, particularly in interior regions, lacks sharp elevation features. Instead, it rises gradually, plateaus forming over extended distances. These formations are difficult to perceive from altitude, especially under reduced visibility. Maps of the era reflected terrain through contour lines and elevation markings, but interpreting those features in real time required constant cross-referencing with estimated position. If position was uncertain, terrain awareness became equally uncertain. Within this operational environment, safety margins were procedural. Minimum safe altitudes were established for route segments, intended to ensure clearance above the highest terrain within a defined area. These altitudes assumed accurate navigation. They depended on the aircraft being where it was expected to be. If that assumption failed, the margin could disappear. Communication between aircraft and ground stations provided limited correction. Radio transmissions could confirm approximate position when signals were clear and bearings reliable. However, signal propagation was not always consistent. Atmospheric conditions, equipment limitations, and distance could affect clarity. In some cases, crews received incomplete or delayed information. Despite these constraints, flights operated daily. The system functioned not through precision, but through consistency. Procedures were followed. Estimates were trusted. Experience filled the gaps left by technology. Most of the time, it was sufficient. On the day of the accident, nothing in the broader system indicated immediate risk. The aircraft was serviceable. The route was routine. The airline procedures reflected accepted standards of the time. Weather, while not ideal, did not present as extreme within available forecasts. There was no single point of failure visible in advance. Only a structure built on assumptions, each one reasonable in isolation, and dependent on the others holding true. Understanding the accident requires separation before integration. Each component, the aircraft, the crew, the environment, and the system supporting them, function within its own limitations. None operated in isolation. Each depended on the others to maintain a stable margin between controlled flight and unintended consequence. Individually, they were sufficient. Together, they formed a structure that could fail without a single point of collapse. Aircraft. The aircraft was a twin-engine, piston-driven transport typical of the late 1940s. Constructed with durability in mind, it featured a metal A-frame, retractable landing gear, and a cockpit equipped with essential flight instruments. It was designed to operate across long distances, often in regions where support infrastructure was minimal. Its performance characteristics were predictable. Cruising speed was moderate, climb capability sufficient, service ceiling adequate for most domestic routes. It was not designed for rapid altitude changes or high-performance maneuvering. Stability, not agility, defined its handling. Inside the cockpit, instrumentation reflected the standards of the time. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon, directional gyroscope, vertical speed indicator, engine gauges monitoring temperature, pressure, and fuel flow. Each instrument provided a single data point. None provided integration. The artificial horizon offered attitude reference, but depended on proper calibration. The altimeter indicated height above sea level, but required accurate pressure settings. The directional gyroscope required periodic realignment with magnetic heading. Errors, even minor ones, could accumulate. There was no terrain awareness system, no forward-looking radar, no automated alert for proximity to ground. The aircraft could indicate how it was flying, but not where it was in relation to unseen obstacles. Reliance on external reference remained essential. Crew. The flight crew operated within a professional framework shaped by wartime experience and post-war transition. Pilots of this era were often highly skilled in manual flying. Many had developed their abilities under demanding conditions, where adaptability and procedural discipline were critical. Training emphasized instrument flying, dead reckoning navigation, radio navigation techniques, engine management. However, the workload was significant. In modern cockpits, many tasks are automated or assisted. In 1950, each function required direct attention, monitoring instruments, maintaining heading, adjusting power settings, calculating position, communicating with ground stations, all occurred simultaneously. Crew coordination existed, but was less formalized than in later decades. Standardized cockpit resource management had not yet been developed. Decision-making often rested heavily on the captain, with support from the co-pilot based on experience rather than structured protocol. Fatigue, task saturation, and cognitive load were recognized challenges, though not yet systematically addressed. In conditions of reduced visibility, reliance on instruments increased, but instruments required trust and interpretation. A discrepancy between expectation and indication could introduce uncertainty. Resolving that uncertainty required time, attention, and accurate mental models of the aircraft's position and environment. The environment presented no immediate extremes. There were no reports of violent storms, severe turbulence, or catastrophic weather systems along the route. Instead, conditions were characterized by subtle degradation, low cloud layers, haze reducing horizontal visibility, gradual transitions rather than abrupt changes. These are conditions that do not force immediate corrective action. They do not compel diversion. They allow continuation while quietly reducing available information. The terrain beneath these conditions was equally deceptive. Unlike mountainous regions with sharp peaks and clear visual cues, this landscape rose slowly. Elevation increased over distance without distinct features to signal the change. From altitude, especially under haze or cloud, it appeared level, but it was not. The absence of visual contrast removed a critical layer of situational awareness. Without visible landmarks, estimating position relative to terrain became dependent entirely on navigation accuracy. If navigation drifted, the environment offered no correction, only silence. Systems. The supporting systems of the time were functional, but limited. Navigation relied heavily on radio beacons, non-directional beacons, NDBs, and low-frequency transmitters. These provided directional guidance when signals were strong and properly interpreted. However, their reliability varied. Signal distortion could occur due to atmospheric conditions, terrain interference, or distance from the source. Bearings could fluctuate. Interpretation required experience and cross-checking. Dead reckoning filled the gaps. Pilots calculated position based on heading, airspeed, wind estimates, and elapsed time. It was a method dependent on accuracy at each step. Small deviations, unnoticed, could compound over distance. There was no continuous positional tracking from the ground. Air traffic services, where available, depended on pilot reports. These reports were periodic, not continuous. Between them, the aircraft existed outside direct observation. Weather reporting systems provided broad overviews, but lacked real-time updates for specific flight paths. A forecast issued before departure could differ from actual conditions encountered en route. Communication itself was subject to limitation. Radio clarity could degrade. Messages could be delayed, misunderstood, or incomplete. In some regions, contact with ground stations was intermittent. Within this system, safety depended on alignment, accurate navigation, reliable interpretation of instruments, stable environmental conditions, effective communication. When these elements aligned, flight proceeded without issue. When they diverged, even slightly, the margin narrowed. No single component in the structure was inherently flawed. The aircraft functioned as designed. The crew operated within their training. The environment presented conditions considered manageable. The systems provided guidance within their capabilities, but none compensated fully for the limitations of the others. And in the absence of redundancy, small discrepancies could persist. unnoticed, uncorrected, until they converged. By the final phase of flight, the conditions had not changed suddenly. There was no sharp transition, no identifiable moment when normal operations became abnormal. Instead, the aircraft continued through a gradually narrowing corridor of certainty, where each instrument still appeared correct, but external confirmation was increasingly absent. The sky had closed in. A uniform layer of cloud now separated the aircraft from the terrain below. Visibility, already reduced earlier, had diminished further into a near-total lack of visual reference. The horizon no longer existed as a line. It had dissolved into a continuous gray field. Inside the cockpit, the aircraft remained stable, airspeed steady, engine performance within expected limits, altitude holding within instrument indications. Nothing suggested immediate distress. Navigation, however, depended on a model of position built from early assumptions. Heading had been maintained. Time had passed as expected, but when influence, subtle and persistent, had likely introduced drift. In conditions like these, even a modest deviation could accumulate significantly over distance. A small displacement on paper, a large displacement over terrain. The crew, operating without external visual cues, relied on instruments and estimation to confirm position. Radio navigation, if available at that moment, provided limited correction, but only within the range and clarity of signal reception. At some point in this phase, the aircraft's actual position and its assumed position began to diverge. Not abruptly, incrementally, below the cloud layer, the terrain continued its silent rise, a plateau formation extending across the region, gradually increasing elevation over distance. From the air, under clear conditions, its shape would have been subtle but readable. Under cloud, it became invisible. There were no lights, no markers, no visual indicators of elevation change. Only distance, only time, only instruments. The descent, when it began, was not immediately recognizable as dangerous. From the cockpit perspective, altitude remained consistent with expectations, but that expectation was tied to an estimated position, one that may have been offset from reality. If the aircraft was farther along its route than assumed, then the ground beneath it was no longer at the elevation expected for that segment. It had risen into its path. The first indication would not have been visual. It would have been subtle, perhaps a change in radio signal clarity, a minor discrepancy in navigation readings, or a routine cross-check producing results that did not fully align. Small inconsistencies that require time to interpret. Time that, in descent, becomes compressed. The aircraft continued forward, speed unchanged, engine steady. The cockpit remained calm in appearance, procedurally normal, instrumentally stable. But stability does not account for unseen proximity. As the aircraft proceeded, terrain elevation continued to increase beneath it. The margin between altitude and ground reduced without direct awareness. In environments like this, there is no auditory warning of terrain, no vibration indicating proximity, no visual reference to signal danger, only instruments that report internal state, not external conflict. At a critical point, the relationship between altitude and terrain would have crossed a threshold, not marked by systems, not highlighted by alarms, only reflected in the reality that the space beneath the aircraft was no longer sufficient. The final moments were not defined by dramatic maneuvering. There is no evidence of abrupt evasive action sustained long enough to alter outcome. Instead, the flight path remained consistent with controlled flight parameters up to the point where terrain and aircraft altitude intersected. Controlled flight continued into rising ground. The impact itself occurred without advance indication in the cockpit environment. No time for correction, no margin remaining for recovery. The aircraft, still functioning as designed, met terrain that had quietly risen into its path. The sequence ended as a continuation of normal flight behavior, until normal behavior was no longer compatible with the environment below. The first challenge was location. In 1950, locating a missing aircraft in remote Australia was not immediate. There was no satellite tracking, no continuous transponder feed, and no radar coverage extending across vast inland regions. Once radio contact ceased, the aircraft effectively disappeared into a large and sparsely monitored environment. Search operations began with the last known position estimate. That estimate was itself dependent on pilot reports, time-based, navigationally derived, and subject to the same limitations that affected the flight itself. Search planners worked outward from a calculated corridor, expanding coverage as uncertainty grew. The terrain complicated every stage. The region was remote, with limited road access and sparse infrastructure. Ground search teams faced long transit times before even reaching likely zones. Aerial searches were the primary method, but visibility from search aircraft was also constrained by weather and the same atmospheric conditions that had affected the flight. Cloud layers, haze, and uneven light reduced the effectiveness of visual scanning. Eventually, wreckage was located in difficult terrain. The discovery confirmed the aircraft had impacted rising ground in controlled flight conditions. There was no indication of in-flight breakup prior to ground contact. The structural pattern was consistent with a high-energy impact at forward speed, aligned with terrain contours. The nature of the damage provided the first key insight. The aircraft had not been disabled before impact. It had arrived intact. The investigation that followed was conducted under the standards and limitations of the time. Accident investigation bodies relied heavily on physical evidence, maintenance records, radio logs, and testimony from operational personnel. Flight data recorders did not exist in commercial service. Cockpit voice recording was not available. Reconstruction depended on inference. Investigators examined the aircraft systems and found no definitive mechanical failure that would have prevented controlled flight. Engines, controls, and primary systems showed no evidence of catastrophic malfunction prior to impact. Attention therefore shifted toward navigation and environmental factors. Radio communication records were reviewed to reconstruct the aircraft's last known transmissions. These helped establish timing but provided limited positional precision. Bearings and reported positions were compared against expected flight progress. Discrepancies emerged. The aircraft's estimated position at certain points likely did not align perfectly with its actual location. Small deviations in heading or wind correction, when accumulated over time, could account for significant lateral displacement. Terrain analysis became central to the findings. The region of impact included rising ground that, under cloud conditions, would not have been visible from altitude. Minimum safe altitude charts for the route existed, but their effectiveness depended on accurate knowledge of position relative to those terrain features. If the aircraft had been even modestly off track, it could have entered terrain that exceeded its assumed clearance. This is a defining characteristic of controlled flight into terrain. The aircraft remains fully functional while external conditions invalidate assumed safety margins. No single failure was identified as decisive. Instead, the investigation pointed to a chain of interacting factors. Dependence on estimated navigation and limited visibility, reduced ability to visually confirm terrain clearance, gradual accumulation of navigational drift, lack of real-time positional awareness, terrain elevation rising into the flight path without visual detection. Each element alone was survivable. Together, they were not. The impact on aviation operations in Australia was measured but meaningful. Airlines and regulatory bodies reviewed procedures related to route planning, minimum safe altitude adherence, and navigation cross-checking. Emphasis increased on positional verification whenever radio navigation was available, particularly in areas with known terrain variation. The accident also reinforced limitations of existing systems. It highlighted that aircraft could be perfectly serviceable, crews properly trained, and procedures correctly followed, yet still be vulnerable when environmental visibility and positional certainty degraded simultaneously. Public reaction reflected the period's understanding of aviation risk. Commercial air travel was still developing its reputation for reliability. Accidents, while deeply significant, were not yet statistically rare in the way they would become in later decades. Each event contributed to incremental change rather than immediate systemic overhaul. Within aviation circles, however, the implications were clear. Navigation accuracy was not a secondary concern. It was central to survival in low-visibility flight over variable terrain. In the years following the accident, aviation in Australia continued to expand. Routes became more frequent. Aircraft performance improved. Communication systems grew more reliable. But the fundamental challenge exposed by this event did not disappear quickly. It remained embedded in the structure of flight itself. Navigation in conditions where the ground cannot be seen. The accident became part of a broader pattern recognized across early commercial aviation worldwide. Controlled flight into terrain occurring not because an aircraft failed mechanically, but because its position relative to the Earth was not accurately known at a critical moment. This distinction mattered. It shifted attention away from mechanical reliability alone and toward situational awareness as a primary safety requirement. At the time, corrective measures were gradual rather than immediate. Airlines and aviation authorities increasingly emphasized stricter adherence to minimum safe altitude rules, improved cross-checking of estimated position, greater reliance on radio navigation fixes when available, more structured route planning over variable terrain. The limitations of dead reckoning became more widely acknowledged. While still essential, it was no longer treated as efficient in isolation when terrain clearance was a critical factor. Navigation aids began to evolve. Ground-based radio systems expanded coverage and reliability. Direction-finding techniques improved. Over time, more precise systems would emerge, reducing dependence on estimation alone. But in 1950, those advancements were still developing. The legacy of this accident was therefore not immediate transformation, but reinforcement of a principle already emerging in aviation safety thinking. An aircraft does not need to lose control to be lost. Controlled flight, under certain conditions, could still lead into terrain if situational awareness degraded without correction. This understanding influenced training evolution in the years that followed. Pilot instruction increasingly emphasized systematic position verification, conservative altitude management in uncertain navigation conditions, heightened awareness of terrain in cloud or reduced visibility, disciplined cross-checking between instruments and navigation estimates. Over time, cockpit procedures became more structured. Decision-making responsibilities were more clearly defined. Later decades would formalize these principles into what is now known as crew resource management, but its early foundations were built from lessons such as this. Technology eventually closed many of the gaps that existed in 1950. Radar surveillance expanded. Satellite navigation transformed positional accuracy. Ground proximity warning systems introduced real-time alerts when aircraft approached terrain. But none of these systems existed at the time of the accident. The crew operated within the tools available to them. The aircraft functioned within its design limits. The environment remained indifferent to the presence of flight. And between those elements, safety depended on alignment that could not always be guaranteed. The final understanding of the accident rests on that imbalance. Not a singular failure, not a single overlooked warning, but a convergence of normal operations within a system where uncertainty could accumulate quietly until it became critical. In modern aviation, the distance between aircraft and terrain is continuously measured, monitored, and warned. In 1950, it was inferred. That difference defines the historical significance of this event. The aircraft's final flight did not end because it stopped flying correctly. It ended because the relationship between flight and terrain was no longer correctly known. And in aviation, that distinction is absolute. The silence that follows such accidents is not empty. It is structured into procedures, into instruments, into training, and into systems designed to ensure that what was once uncertain becomes continuously visible. Each improvement carries forward the same objective: to ensure that controlled flight remains separated from unseen ground, and that separation, once fragile, is now maintained as a constant, not through awareness alone, but through design.